thank you so much for, gosh, almost 200 people on the call already. Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar today, where we'll be exploring the power of AI narratives. By way of introduction, my name is Yasmin Ibison. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, leading on our new AI for Public Good workstream. And before I introduce the agenda and the speakers that we've got today, I just wanted to run through some brief housekeeping about the session today. So this is a Zoom webinar, so everyone except myself and the speakers will be on mute throughout. You can switch on auto-generated subtitles for this webinar event in the Zoom settings. I think someone might have switched those on already. As part of the webinar, you'll have access to the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. Please do submit questions throughout, and if there is a particular question that lots of you want to be answered or to be asked to our panel, you can upvote this by clicking on the little thumbs up icon, and I will try and prioritize these as part of the Q&A. Also, we will collate any questions that we don't get around to answering today and share our thoughts on these after the event, along with sending you all a recording as the webinar is being recorded right now of the event itself, and also the slide deck. So that's the housekeeping. And I thought I'd briefly just kick us off with a little bit of an introduction to the AI for Public Good program at JRF, for those of you that aren't aware of it. So our aim of this program is to kind of broaden and deepen existing AI debates, cut through some of the hype on this topic in order to explore both the practical implications of AI, looking at this through in both the public sector as well as in civil society, alongside zooming out and questioning some of the deeper moral undertones of AI advancement relating to values, power, and relationships. However, today's event, we're going to be focusing on specifically on the power of AI narratives. When we think of mainstream AI narratives, these are the most common stories, perspectives, and beliefs that are widely shared and accepted by the public about AI. Narratives shape how people understand and feel about AI, its development, and its impact on society. And crucially, narratives can also influence decisions. You all may be able to reflect on the narratives you've consumed already about AI. Where have they come from and what impact have they had? Today, we'll be hearing from 4 brilliant speakers. Each has written an essay on AI narratives as part of this AI for Public Good program, and all of these essays are published on JRF's website. If you haven't read them already, please do take a look, as they're all fantastic. We also previously shared around a document explaining key terms and definitions from these essays, and this was in order to support people who have maybe less technical expertise on AI or who are new to this topic to engage with this conversation. And I think we're going to repost the link to this key terms and definitions document in the chat too, in case any of you want to have that open as part of this conversation. So that's enough from me. I'm now going to invite each speaker to give a brief overview of their essay's argument. As I said, please do pop any questions in the Q&A function throughout this. And after we've heard from all 4 speakers, I'll chair a discussion drawing on any of your questions. So first off, we've got Daniel Stanley, who is the Executive Director of the Future Narratives Lab. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Yasmin. Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming. As Yasmin just said, my name's Dan from an organisation called Future Narratives Lab. Yeah, and I'm just going to go through a very quick presentation today. Yeah, I'll be trying to pack a lot in, so if there's anything I miss, apologies for that, or if there's anything you want to catch up on, hopefully will be reflected in my article, or do ask questions, and I'm always happy to chat if you want to get in touch afterwards. Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, for the same reasons, I won't say too much about us as an organisation. Do take a look on our website. There's a couple of things on the homepage on this sort of topic that might be of interest. But yeah, I will start off, because we have kind of narrative in our name. I sort of feel like we have a responsibility to do a little bit of the definitional work about what we mean by that. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. Yeah, so it's a word that gets used to mean lots of different things. You'll have heard it used in many different ways. Obviously, the most sort of traditional, familiar usage is just the sort of part of a story that sort of tells you what's happening. But more and more, it's being used in this sort of wider sense that it's used in my essay and the other essays as a kind of way of understanding when we look at the way that a topic is discussed and the way that a topic kind of exists in public discourse. Why is it that certain elements of that get kind of prioritized and seen as important, and other things get seen as sort of irrelevant and left out, even when they can be seen logically as sort of similarly significant? Yeah, so there'll be some, that's obviously very brief. There'll be some really good examples of that in the presentations that we'll hear today. But I'll start with an example from my essay that is of that kind of original, traditional, familiar sense of narrative, and how even that can have an influence on how we think about AI and the decisions we make. So next slide, please. So yeah, last year, President Biden signed an executive order on AI, one of the biggest pieces of legislation yet. And his chief of staff came out straight after and said that that had been directly influenced by a viewing of the last Mission Impossible film, in which the main enemy is a rogue AI called the Entity. Yeah, so you can see that there's like, you know, a very clear direct link, even from that kind of very basic sense of narrative, to the decisions that are being made. Next slide, please. And that kind of like dramatic way of thinking about AI has obviously permeated through into a lot of our debates, whether that's sort of very big aspirational claims about what AI is capable of, or next slide, please. Or on the other hand, maybe even more common are kind of these big pronouncements about the risks of AI and, you know, what we should be doing to stop the danger of AI. These things might seem quite at odds. Actually, they have quite a lot in common. So, you know, they are very focused on the future. They do want to make these sort of big claims about the possibilities of the technology, and they're trying to direct attention towards that sort of future rather than on what's happening now and today to normal people, and towards kind of thinking, oh, well, we need to listen to these experts or people who are involved. So next slide, please. Yeah, I won't talk too much about this. It's a complicated area, but yeah, if you look at some of the kind of beliefs of the people who have been very involved in propagating these kind of perspectives, they have some quite strange, exotic kind of thoughts about the future, sort of mystical ideas of sort of transcending humanity through technology. But the important thing really is that what is happening is kind of its meaning that lots of important things about AI are being missed as we focus on this sort of imaginary kind of future and what might be happening. So next slide, please. So what is being missed? Well, you know, one of the most obvious things is the sort of material costs of AI. So huge data centers. This is being built just up the road from where I live, I've just found out. Huge billion-dollar data center using huge amounts of water, resources, energy. Not something that gets discussed nearly enough in the conversation. Next slide, please. And there's also, of course, a human cost to these systems. So, you know, the people obviously were affected by AI systems being implemented today. There's also a huge amount of human labor, often very poorly treated, you know, in traumatic kind of working conditions, moderating and training these AI systems. They don't just sort of spring up from nowhere from data. They actually involve a load of sort of sweatshop type labor to kind of make them work. That's really not recognized nearly enough. Next slide, please. But I want to just finish by talking a bit about kind of a wider thing that I think is missed, a kind of fundamental aspect to AI that's often kind of obscured by these focuses on the future, and that is a bigger trend, really, of which you can see a current wave of AI as a part. So increasingly, we live in a kind of society, and our lives are kind of more and more datafied, subject to datification. I won't give a kind of proper full definition of that here, but a simple one is the more and more of our day-to-day interactions and actions are measured, and are then value is extracted from those measurements. And then, you know, what's happening now is more and more we are being encouraged to take actions and interactions that can be measured, and so it's kind of influencing the shapes of our lives. And these AI models are so data hungry. They rely on this sort of mass extraction on data being taken and more data becoming available about everything we're doing. And, you know, next slide, please. The fact that this can be done is the result of an effort over the last kind of few decades to convince us of the nature of data as being something that is individual and personal to us. So you'll see lots of the big tech companies have made a real concerted effort to push the idea of personal responsibility and privacy around data, that we should think of it as individual. What they know that they don't say is that most data, and certainly the most valuable data, is actually can't be discretely assigned to an individual. It's about the relationships and the connections between us. And so by making us think about it as something personal, they're able to just get on with exploiting that kind of collective common space. And that's kind of fundamental to their models, is that we don't think about what's happening in that collective space. So next slide, please. And yeah, analogies have been made in what they're doing here to sort of historical similarities with, the processes of sort of enclosure in the 19th century of common land, but also kind of how settler colonialists would, declare commonly owned land of the indigenous people as being owned by nobody because it wasn't privately owned and therefore could be seized. This idea that no one owns this because it's no individual. And you can see a kind of parallels with what's happening with data. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I sort of finished with the argument in my essay that my contention is if we do want to sort of build an alternative way of doing AI and we want to approach technology differently, we need to think about this, and what we need to do is start at that level of getting people to understand the sort of collective nature of data and building a kind of public concept of data as a common good. In order that we can then be able to build the sort of institutions and arrangements that would make it work for us as a collective. Yeah, so that's a whistle-stop tour through. Yeah, hopefully do let me know any questions you have, and I really look forward to hearing the other presentations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dan. We've already got some fantastic questions in the chat, in the Q&A function, sorry, that we can return to later. I'm now going to bring in Tanya Duarte, who is the founder of We and AI, to give an overview of her essay. Tanya.
Hi, thank you, Yasmin. We're delighted to be part of this work stream at GRF looking at narratives. And as Yasmin said, as a way to understand the way in which power dynamics, relationships and values, sorry, I apparently just didn't move enough. My light's gone off, it's back on. As a way to understand the way in which power dynamics, relationships and values related to AI and the social sector are built and what the impact of this is. So it's really great to follow on from Daniel, who's kind of talked a bit about those narratives. And our part of the puzzle in digging into these narratives through the essay that I should add that I wrote with Ismail Karoubi Garcia, who is a colleague at We in AI and also does some great other things in AI. It is related to how public power is limited by the widespread inability to decode these motivations and realities behind these kind of often misleading AI narratives. And I should say that it's very much just a part of a puzzle because there are many other bits that need to work together. So it's great to be here with Emma and with Jenny as well, because we all need to have kind of layers of solutions to be able to see how public voice, AI for public good can really work from a public perspective rather than a top-down perspective. And our kind of aim is to explain how AI literacy, so understanding more about AI, can kind of underpin a lot of other efforts whenever people are engaging about AI. So our motivation as an organisation is related to increasing the diversity of people involved in decision-making around AI. It's important for people to make decisions which reflect the interests and values of their communities rather than not being able to engage through not having relevant information or being co-opted by very well-funded agendas, falling for false flags, or simply having their input limited by the framing of the conversations that's presented to them. So you can see in this picture that we've done, I'll talk about pictures a little bit. One of our projects is better images of AI. This idea that the design and conversations tend to happen in ivory towers, and we're left trying to kind of catch up and reach out and grab hold of these conversations. And we want to advocate for, a greater ability to do that. So moving on to the next slide, I set up We and AI at the beginning of 2020 to raise awareness of the risks and rewards of AI among the public, particularly those most missing from the AI workforce, from decision-making places, from data sets, etc. And I did this after 30 years working in the for-profit sector and being very involved in making money by exciting people about the capabilities of technology to make them money. So that's kind of my background, and I felt that there needed to be more awareness of what was going on in the kind of work that I was doing. But what we can see, fast forward a few years, started, really gaining traction after the launch of ChatGPT at the end of 2022, is that yes, we have increased awareness now of AI, and a lot of people think we've raised awareness of the risks and rewards of AI, but in actual fact, awareness doesn't equate necessarily to understanding. And you can see here that last year, AI is now massively publicly visible. Word of the year. Hallucinations is also one of the word of the years in another in a different dictionary. So the AI words are like words of the years, great awareness, very little understanding amongst lots of places of what that actually means. And it's beautifully illustrated here by the fact that both of the articles I've picked out here about this fact contain white robots, which don't actually tell you about the kind of AI that is being reflected in the usage of these terms. Well, maybe usage of the terms, but certainly not usage of the technologies. We don't have robots like the one on the left that are kind of AI robots. And when we're talking about hallucinations, we're generally not talking about social care robots. So you can see how confused how confusing it is from a narrative point of view, and the kind of science fiction narratives that Daniel mentioned are really where a lot of the debate still is. So moving on, we need to define what we mean by AI literacy as a solution to this. And I think it's really key to say that it's different from computer skills, computer science, from traditional IT or technology. There are things, and we write this in the essay, that are different about learning about AI from just learning about technology. They're to do with autonomy, the way it learns, inscrutability, which we've quoted. And so what we're talking about is not having a solely technical lens, but instead AI literacy programs have to look at the social implications of technologies. You can't learn about the technology in isolation. The next slide, please. There's been a lot of work done on that frankly is not being used at the moment, certainly in this country, and I'd say more generally. This pyramid is a really old kind of pyramid of pedagogy, how we learn, that has been looked at in the context of 30 different research papers on how to teach AI, and kind of remapped by the authors of this paper, Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea is that the kind of bottom layers should be something that everybody in the population can have. And they don't. So, the fact that people think that ChatGPT understands them, and that's, lawyers, that's, doctors, that's all sorts of people, shows that the degree to which we are not using this triangle. And every time we talk about AI, people will find their own way to explain it. Technology companies will often explain it as, AI is like, think of AI as your friend, and that's, that's not encouraging an understanding of actually what it is. Next slide, please. So this is a framework that I've been working on with the IEEE working group on data and AI skills, literacy and readiness. It's just one framework, but it looks very much at this role where we don't just have one level, as now we're using generative AI, particularly as individuals, that we have a role of consuming, providing, that we need to understand how to do that responsibly. Recognize the limits and capabilities in order to make decisions. Next slide, please. One of the things that we talk about in the essay is the fact that the UK is lagging behind many other countries in terms of a commitment to this public, empowerment. The only organisation in the UK is Scottish AI Alliance that have actually put a commitment to this, and we worked with them to build a course which is I've put this up because I think it's open for enrolment now. It's a 5-week online course about living with AI in society. And Emma will talk about the fact that, yes, this is a digital course and we have a huge issue with digital divide, but it's a really good start, and I'd encourage you to look at it and hope it inspires others. Next slide, please. So that's the kind of summary, basically, that we need to have in order to be able to decode these narratives that do concentrate power and restrict debates. And I give some examples of that in the essay. We really do need a commitment that is in line, why not more than other national AI programs? And it needs to be developed with civil society, not by tech companies. I give examples of how tech companies are filling the void at the moment with kind of explainers that give things, from their perspective in a way to sell technology. So yeah, that's basically it. If we go to the final slide, I've put there a link. I mentioned images, and some of the images used in the JRF project are images that we've provided for free through the Better Images of AI project, and there's a guide there if you're involved in communicating about AI. And please do check us out, and some of our other programs around how you deliver a better understanding about AI from a social technical point of view.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya. That was fantastic. I can already see that we've got loads of brilliant questions coming in the Q&A function. So please keep upvoting those as we move on to Dr. Emma Stone, who is the Director of Evidence and Engagement from Good Things Foundation. Emma, hello.
Yeah, hi, Yasmin. Hi, everyone. So as Yasmin said, I work for Good Things Foundation. And if I could have the next slide, please. Just a little bit about us. We're the UK's leading digital inclusion charity. We run a national network of community organisations, libraries, others, supporting them to respond to local need, including through free mobile data, refurbished devices, and resources to help build people's digital confidence in the communities they work in. So when it comes to narratives around AI, one of the things that I have been worried about is that whilst hugely important, they might also take policy, media and public attention away from the more mundane but stark realities of digital inequalities. And a fear that they're creating fear and distrust more than engagement, making it even harder for people who aren't currently online to take that step. And I do believe that AI can support inclusion, can be part of being a leveler, but it clearly also comes with big questions around ownership, ethics, responsibilities, and inequalities. And so one of the starting points for my essay has been to say that, AI has really already shifted the goalposts of what it means to be digitally included. The capabilities that we need today are different than they were even just 2 years ago. And the risks of harms and uneven benefits feel greater too. So next slide, please. What I've done is I've framed my essay around red flags, green shoots, and amber warnings. So the red flags: 10 million adults lack the most basic level of digital skills, and 2.5 million households in the UK are struggling to afford home broadband at the moment. Digital exclusion, we know, is most likely to affect people who are older and across all ages, people who are in poverty. And it really has profound consequences in people's lives, for their opportunities, for our society and economy. And so this does mean that I find it really hard to see how we can have a future in which AI benefits everyone without first fixing the UK's digital divide. And so that's about digital access and skills and support. But when it comes to AI, it's also about the invisibility of digitally excluded people in those data sets, in debates, and in the design of support to use AI. Digitally excluded people have a lower digital footprint. And so both the likelihood and impact of AI bias are almost bound to be higher where policies and decisions informed by AI impact people who need public and health services most and are more likely to be digitally excluded or lower users of digital because of old age, poverty, fear, distrust. And in these AI narratives and the debates, the loudest voices are coming from those who are already digitally engaged. So failure to engage the public, including digitally excluded people, will mean failure to build trust, failure to build AI to benefit all. And I know Jenny is going to talk about this far more eloquently after me. And then building on what Tanya was saying, thinking about the design of support. So when I was writing my essay for JRF, I actually heard Andy Burnham talk really positively about a meeting of Bloomberg mayors where they were given a 3-hour teach-in about generative AI. And teach-ins and explainers on AI shouldn't just be for Bloomberg mayors. AI needs to be on the nation's curriculum, from classrooms to community centres, shaped and led by people who you can trust. And community centres, next slide please, is where I see some green shoots. This quote comes from Casper Kennedale in South London. He's the managing director of Clear Community Web, which is a social enterprise in the National Digital Inclusion Network. And one of the things that they're doing at the moment as part of their digital inclusion work is creating safe spaces to talk about AI and to support people with lower digital skills and confidence to have a go themselves, such as using ChatGPT to write a letter of complaint to a landlord and be able to have those wider conversations about what this means. And it immediately helps to take AI out of the realm of robots and into people's everyday life. Community organisations, national charities like Good Things, we're trying to work out how best we can, how to help people discuss, discover and learn about AI, like We in AI is doing brilliantly, and co-creating this with community partners and businesses. But this is where I move from my green shoots into amber warnings. Next slide, please. Because for every community organisation like Clear Community Web, there are thousands who feel out of their depth and really overwhelmed. And that isn't made easier by polarised narratives among tech elites. And it's also where we do need to focus on responsibility, regulation, redress, understanding the reality of what our role is, how we can benefit, but also what we can expect as citizens and a civil society, whether that's from companies, regulators, also from our government. And so to wrap up with the final slide, AI has already shifted the goalposts of digital inclusion. We're a digital inclusion charity. We're already taking up the challenge of getting our heads around it, because if our vision for AI is about an inclusive, equitable future, we need to respond in ways that really speak to that. We need to fix the UK's digital divide, and we really do need to bring everyone on the journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was absolutely fantastic. And there's been some brilliant feedback in the Q&A box about all of the kind of quality and kind of the quality and the insights coming from the presentations thus far. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A discussion that is to follow. But first and last but not least, sorry, we've got our final presentation here from Jenny Tennyson, who is the Executive Director of Connected by Data. Jenny.
Thanks, Yasmin, and great to be here and be able to talk about this. So yes, my essay is entitled "Let's Give People Power Over AI," and I wrote it with one of the members of my team, Tim Davies. So if we go to the next slide, Dan's already talked about how some of the big narratives that we see around AI are things like that it's complex, that it's ununderstandable, that you need to be an expert in AI to have some idea about its impact, that the risks that AI brings are in some way new or unknown or in the future, and also the idea that that we have, each of us, individual responsibility to act in this world. You know, a lot of the kind of privacy controls that we have are things that we're supposed to do individually. And all of these narratives are essentially disempowering. They're telling us that we require training to qualify to make decisions about the role that AI and data should have in our lives. The individualized narrative actually diffuses power. It stops us from gathering together and having collective action in the world. And it also creates the kind of fear and distrust that Emma mentioned, that holds us back from being able to positively engage with data and AI and use it for our own benefit. So all of these narratives build us towards this kind of vicious cycle where power in the world gives organizations power over what data is collected, over the AI that is used, and the power over data and AI leads to more power in the world. And so we get more and more kind of concentration of power around the use of data and AI. We need to break that cycle. And the way in which we need to break that cycle is to have more, I think, collective decision making in the way in which data and AI gets used. Go on to the next slide. I want to give an example of what that could look like. During the AI Safety Summit last year in November, we ran a people's panel on AI where we gathered people from across the country. That we selected 12, only 11 could turn up, unfortunately, because of COVID. One of them got COVID, but they were representative of all sorts of different backgrounds, ways, and lived experience, different kind of levels on the scale of digital literacy and of AI literacy as well. And we brought them together to watch sessions during the AI Fringe around the AI Safety Summit and to deliberate about what was going on and what they thought the recommendations should be for policymakers about it. You go on to the next slide. This slide just shows some of the things that they said after listening to some of those sessions. So, for example, they were pleased to see the focus on creative industries and education, on jobs, on elections in the debates that they were watching, but were disappointed about the lack of meaningful focus on AI and climate, which was one of the things that Dan mentioned earlier. But my general point about this is that these were people who were not AI literate, and some of them not having the kind of digital skills and confidence, but through the process of bringing them into a space and supporting them, having proper deliberation with them, they were able to get to grips with this topic quickly, have opinions about it that were relevant and that were helpful in directing our priorities and the kinds of things that organizations should be doing about it. If you go on to the next slide, please. And so I think that we need to be using this kind of pattern a lot more. At the moment, we have a focus on these two levels of either kind of top-down regulation, where we say that, you know, these technologies are good, these technologies are bad, and have some control at a very high kind of national level. And then we have our individual controls and ability to opt in or opt out to particular technologies, which we often don't actually exercise. But the way that data and AI gets used requires us to have a much more contextual governance around the way in which particular technologies get rolled out in particular contexts. And that contextual governance needs to include the voices of the people who are going to be affected by those technologies, as Tanya was talking about. I don't think that we can afford to have a lack of AI literacy or digital skills as an excuse for not involving people in that governance. And I think that we can set up kind of practices like the People's Panel on AI as mechanisms for bringing people into that conversation that are actually really beneficial. If we go into the next slide, please. And involving the public in these ways, giving them actual power and collective responsibility for decision making over data and AI has all sorts of benefits. It means that those technologies are more oriented towards public good and have ethical practices associated with them. It builds public trust and means that we're operating within the social license for these technologies being rolled out. But also having those conversations builds the data and digital and AI literacy and skills that we know that people need in order to take advantage of these technologies and be able to benefit from them. And I think, therefore, it helps us to get to the kind of innovation and adoption that is often touted as a goal of this, although I will question whether that should be a goal of what we're doing with AI. So if we go to the next slide. So that's really what my organisation, Connected by Data, is focused on. It's about giving communities a powerful say over data and AI, finding the right kinds of mechanisms and practices that we can put into place around the governance of data and AI to ensure that people have a powerful say. And I would say that that includes having active civil society and empowered civil society organisations being part of the conversation, not just going to the individuals with lived experience, but recognising the real power of collective action in this space. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was really, really wonderful. The question box has been going, has been popping off the whole time of this panel, so that has been fantastic. And I want to spend the next 20 minutes really exploring as many questions from the audience as we can. If we could take the slides down, I think that would be nicer so we can all see each other. And I wanted to kick off with a question from Dominica that says that I'd be interested in hearing panelists' thoughts on the narrative choice to keep referring to everything as AI versus differentiating what we're actually talking about. It feels like a marketing choice to try to steer conversation towards certain topics and away from others, plus muddling the water of what we mean when we say AI. So Dan, you've touched on this. Tanya, you've also kind of talked about this in the literary sense. I don't know who wants to come in on that question with any thoughts.
I don't mind kicking off. I mean, I think it'd be great to hear others' thoughts on this particularly, but yeah, this was just a specific thing. This is a thing that I cut from the essay that I really wanted to include, but unfortunately left out because yeah, it's such an interesting part of it is yeah, there has definitely been a very conscious effort to say this is what AI is and expand that definition for a lot of things which very much don't involve much of what we might think is needed for something to be qualified as AI, but then it pushes it into a category of things that are then treated in a particular way. And so some of what I touched on in terms of the fact that there are, you know, some things that are effectively kind of click farms that are then being, you know, where there's hundreds of very low paid people just essentially doing things manually, and then they're being presented as if there is some sort of artificial machine intelligence behind them. And certainly a lot of the technology is certainly developed in that way, which again isn't really surfaced. So there's a whole space there around, yeah, AI as a kind of framing device to push a particular agenda and certainly to kind of make certain things seem valuable. Lots of startups have kind of said, oh, what we're doing is now AI, you know, because it has some small element of algorithmic kind of decision making involved in it. But where the line is drawn between like machine learning and kind of algorithms and, you know, lots of things that we already do are could very easily be qualified as AI, but, you know, 2 years ago would not have been called that. So it's a fascinating space. There was nowhere near space in my piece to look at. The only one other thing I'll very briefly add was another kind of related question, which I didn't get to include, which is the question about what counts as intelligence in the first place. And there's a whole history there of like, you know, very dubious practices in terms of what the measurement of intelligence and the fact that we see certain things as intelligent or not intelligent and why and how. And this has been sort of, this loaded term has been brought into the way that we talk about artificial intelligence as well. So it gets into kind of very, very semantic sort of abstract discussion, but I think it has real impact. So it's a really interesting area, but I'll hand over to others who might have thoughts on that.
Tanya and then Jenny, and then Emma, if you want to come in as well.
Yeah, great question. And I'd add to what Daniel said, that about intelligence, it's actually a very Western narrative. And that's why we like to avoid pictures of glowing blue brains. The whole issue of intelligence, that isn't actually what wanted to say. What I wanted to say was beyond that, which is the whole term artificial intelligence is complete nonsense within itself. So I think that actually starting to have, you know, if we get hung up on trying to define AI or say, well, this is just an algorithm or this is machine learning or whatever, it's kind of missing the point in a way, which is like AI itself is a completely arbitrary term. A lot of the time, you know, it's not artificial, it's not intelligent. We don't know what intelligence means to different people. And so absolutely it's a marketing and media and, you know, kind of controlling term that points us over here. So completely agree on that, Dominica. What I would say is that it probably is useful for organizations to think about how they want to define AI. So if you're engaging with it, you've got an AI policy, or you've got, you're doing a program on AI, it's probably worth thinking about, when we say that, what do we mean in relation to what's important to us? And your view on that is just as relevant as, a Stanford professor or whatever. It's a very disputed territory. What I think, really we're often talking about is the bit where you start, where it moves from kind of data-driven technologies, is where you start to kind of outsource decision-making and agency and the rest of it. And that still involves people. At any point, we're still actually. So I think that's what I want to say. No uncertain terms about the breaking it down into different technologies. Absolutely, so much more helpful to say to people, we're talking about, Siri, or we're talking about, object recognition, or whatever it is. That's part of, what I would term literacy, is being able to break down what applications and impacts are.
Thanks, Tanya. Jenny?
Yeah, just two things to add to those, which I completely agree with. One is that very often when we're looking at the risks and harms, but also benefits that can come out of AI, we're actually talking about benefits and risks that come from any data processing, any big data processing from lots of data. So one of the things that we tend to do is also talk about data all the time, data-based and data-driven kinds of technologies, because actually that's the span that we need to be caring about in terms of risks and harms. So that's one thing. And then the second thing about breaking it down and becoming specific, this is one of the things I was getting at around needing that contextual governance. It really matters, the specifics of what data you're talking about, how it's being collected, what exactly the automated system will be doing, how that fits in with the process of other things that are going on around that decision making. Like, all of those things really matter when it comes to the governance of a particular system and the rollout and the kinds of impacts that it will have, say, in a workplace or in a school or in a hospital. So getting specific and breaking it down is really important. But using AI as a kind of glossy term, we just have to recognize that that's how it is right now. It will be another term in a few years' time.
Thanks, Jenny. Emma, did you want to come in on that, or I can ask? There's loads of questions.
Yeah, so Yasmin, feel free if you want to direct, because I was actually, or maybe I can do a bit of bridging in my response to pick up on some of the other questions.
Go for it.
Because I think all the conversation we're having now is why, at the moment, we're finding it at Good Things really, really interesting, fascinating, and challenging to develop some short pieces of learning content that can be used by community organisations to provide some form of explainer for people who may have lower digital skills and confidence about what we're talking about. And everyone's absolutely right. The more specific you get, the better. But actually, the jargon, the language, these are they're a real obstacle in talking about this. And Jenny's absolutely right. A couple of years we were talking about how do we build people's data literacy? Is that part of digital literacy? There's media literacy, there's health literacy, and all of this is happening in a world which is infused with digital, with data, and with AI now thrown into the mix. So it's just really bringing that challenge to light. And I think on that narratives point, I was really interested in some of the comments and questions around even how we talk about risks as opposed to trade-offs, and the downsides of, again, this binary sort of narrative around there's risks and then there's rewards. And actually, I think, Tom, you're absolutely right. There are real trade-offs here, although I don't want to ignore the fact that there are both risks and benefits as well as the trade-offs in the middle. And I really loved Alexi's point as well about the concept of human agency. And again, I think that's something that we're trying to do in terms of how we're wanting to engage people, both give people that sense of human agency. I think that's why that example about Casper and supporting people to have a go gives you a different sort of agency, albeit it's just with one tool, and it opens up a different sort of conversation. But alongside that, human agency and supporting that shouldn't come at the cost of the responsibility of regulators, governments and companies. And it shouldn't be part of, yes, let's push all of that personal responsibility down to the individual. Takes us right back to what Dan was saying at the start about that emphasis on personal data responsibility. So there's so many different things we've got to balance in all of this.
I wanted to kind of try and also do what you've just done, Emma, by combining a few questions, because there are just so many, and we're not going to get through them all, but we will send round a follow-up with responses to those that we can't answer. And this was trying to make the link between AI narratives and policy making. So there was a question from Tom in the Q&A box around how we may build stronger narratives to ensure that policymakers don't view AI as a solution to all ills, and recognize that AI may, in some cases, exacerbate harms. So I know, Tanya, you touched on AI and policymaking in your essay. Like a lot of people have touched on this in their essays, thinking about maybe explaining a bit more the relationship between current narratives and policymaking, and what's the impact of that, and what might we do about it. So I don't know if someone wants to come in. Emma, come back in.
Yeah, I could come back in on this. I think Tom's absolutely right. And this is also still an extension of what we've already been seeing around online services more generally. And so, you know, the NHS is a classic example. There is such a big push towards digital transformation that is leaving people behind. Policymakers, funders, but the Treasury needs online service provision to work really well in order to kind of stack up bills, unless or until, you know, the public is willing to pay much more for health services for everyone. And so I do think there is that element here of AI is yet another area in which, yes, there can be brilliant efficiencies, but I do think there is also awareness and concern about the risks, and we just have to keep pushing forward on some of that. And again, to the point earlier, there is a trade-off there, right? You know, we know that with things like the NHS app, there is a trade-off for all of us about how much of our own personal data we give when we register with the NHS app. And not giving that data creates less friction for us in using it, makes it simpler, but it also means it's harder to be able to then understand or connect that data and use it in ways that could potentially improve the quality of data around use of the, you know, so all of these are trade-offs really, but we need to have more of that open debate, and policymakers need to be more honest and open about looking at this in the round. So Tom McGrath, you're absolutely spot on as ever.
Jenny, do come in, and then Tanya.
Cool. So I think a couple of things that I just wanted to pose here around this for policymakers. I think one of the things is the narrative that we have, where we talk about data and AI technologies as being either good or bad. It's like data for good or AI for good versus I don't know, is it data for bad and AI for bad? I don't think anybody's trying to do that. Whereas actually every technology that we're rolling out, there are winners and there are losers. There are people who benefit more and there are people who benefit less. And I think that there's something about how we talk about the outcomes as not being either good or bad, as if that's the choice that we have to make, but actually it's about the multifaceted kinds of changes that we will be seeing. And then this leads on to my second point, which is when you think about winners and losers, when you think about who's going to benefit and who isn't going to benefit, then it becomes a much more kind of values-driven conversation about who do we want to see benefiting from these kinds of technologies, where are our priorities, what is it that where should we be putting our effort? And one of the things that I find frustrating about the policymaking debate around data and AI is that it is not yet a really political one, and it needs to be, because the values that are being built into the way in which we develop technology and AI means that it is a values-based question about who we want to win and who we don't want to win in this situation. whereas the actual policy making and political conversation right now is very much rah, we need to use AI in order to meet our cost efficiency objectives within the public sector and so on, without really recognizing that there are different ways to do that. There are different kinds of approaches that you could be taking. So I think that we need to bring in more of that kind of nuance around the kinds of impacts of technology and AI, and to try and make it a political question, make it something that is about our political leaders actually choosing who those winners are.
Thanks, Jenny. Dan, I'm happy for you to come in, and Tanya, and then I've got a very specific question about the Commons, Dan, for you. So I'll come.
Okay.
I'll let you come in on this first.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, it's really, I think Jenny covered a lot of the ground of what I wanted to say there, I think. But I'd just maybe introduce one other kind of concept into it that I probably didn't get a chance to talk about in the essay. There's a small paragraph in there about how the fact that, like, a lot of if you look at the narratives around AI that are being pushed, you know, the surface level of them is quite kind of like exotic and new, or at least kind of like dramatic. But actually, fundamentally, the structure of what's being pushed for is not actually that new. It's really kind of a set of quite familiar things that monopolizing companies are trying to kind of grasp the benefits of a new technology, and they're trying to make out that the decisions need to be made by a set of experts and not by the public, and that it's a question of efficiency and what is the best scientific way of doing things, rather than a question of politics and democracy and balancing interests and debating. And so it is, you know, fundamentally, I think, a sort of technocratic vision, and I think that's the sort of thing we need to be pushing back against, is that this should be something that is about democracy. It is about different people with different interests coming together and making decisions about what should happen and who wins and loses, and that there's not like a perfect optimization outcome that, you know, where everyone wins and it's utopia, or we avoid being all killed by rogue AI. It's a thing where it's a matter of democracy, it's a matter of politics. It's not about this technocratic way of making decisions. And so I think that's kind of a way of thinking about what some of the others said. So I'll pass it to Tanya to talk about that more.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, following on from what everyone said, it very much is political. And as an example, there is an article just come out in the FT in the last few hours about how we have a crisis in energy, our kind of energy production in this country. This is I wasn't aware of this till this morning, and it basically says AI is now expected to consume 10 times more power by 2026 than it did last year. And you know, this cuts across every area of policy. You know, this is not a siloed kind of like, you know, particular departmental thing. And this is why I think Jenny's work at Connected by Data, and who work with this way as well, to think about, you know, other methods of kind of deliberative processes and engagement is really important, because at the moment this is not happening at policy level. The kind of the overview that is needed is just not happening, and we need to have better ways of public involvement in that. And I fully support that. You know, really interested to talk about that. What seems to me to be a fundamental issue is that, you know, Dan's word technocrat, is that the reliance on tech companies to solve problems is really, really prevalent in government at the moment. We've, you know, seen what happens with the Horizon system, you know, etc., and no lessons are being learned there. And I mentioned my background is in business. I, you know, did a master's in business at, you know, the turn of the century, very, very long time ago. And I can absolutely tell you that the fundamental purpose of business is to increase shareholder value. That is it. It is not to look after society. So turning to technology to solve the problems in the NHS, you know, to give people chatbots instead of doctors, whatever it is, it's completely flawed thinking, because the tech companies are not there for us. We need to make it a priority. We need to impact shareholder value. You know, this is capitalism, whether you can debate it all day, but this is where we are. How do we change? How do we make it a shareholder priority? to actually look after society. They're not going to do it because they're, you know, nice, and that doesn't seem to be understood. You know, much as the people in organizations would like to because they're nice, they can't. And so yeah, we really need to all take some individual responsibility for playing our part in making it a shareholder priority.
Thanks, Tanya. We've got about 5 minutes just under left of the event, and I want to leave a minute at the end for myself to wrap up. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn to just think and very briefly, my question as chair's privilege is going to say, is going to be, what would be one of the one things that you would want people to take away, or the main thing that you'd want people to take away from today's session? Obviously, there's been a whole load of conversations, and it's great to see that there's so much appetite, enthusiasm, interest in this as a topic, and we'll take those away and try and provide some answers or thoughts on the rest of the questions. But I want to give each of you in turn just an opportunity to kind of either answer a question that you've seen in the chat, or hammer home a point, or say something that you've not been able to mention, thinking about, yeah, one thing that you'd want people to take away today from today's session. I don't know who wants to jump in first. If no one does, I'll have to just pick someone else. We'll run out of time. Emma, you're smiling and nodding at me. Do you want to come in? Thank you.
I always smile and nod. Yeah, so I think I would really impress on everyone still, do not forget the fact that there are millions of people who lack the digital access and/or the skills and confidence to be able to engage. And when we're having those conversations with policymakers, with our peers, with politicians, let's remind of the importance of addressing that. And we can address those together. It's not an either or, we can address them together.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma. Who's next? Jenny? Brill.
Okay. So I think the thing I would like to impress on people is that we can't wait to be invited into this conversation. It is something that we need to actively force ourselves into, and I would love to see more people demanding that they and their communities have a say in the way in which data and AI is being adopted in their local authorities, in their schools, in their hospitals, in their workplaces. I think it's really important that we come together and are active around forcing our voices into this conversation.
Thanks, Jenny. Tanya or Dan?
Well, I just had a bit of a rant, so I think I'll keep it really short, just to echo really what Jenny and Emma have said. To say this really is about kind of working together and providing that alternative narrative that comes from the ground up, and as much as we can all work together, and the work that Yasmin, you're doing at JRF to kind of answer another one of the questions which is in the chat, which what is public good, how do we measure that, you may well be talking more about some of the work that you're doing there, I think is absolutely pivotal. So every moment that we can take to kind of commit to kind of building that picture, I think is really important.
Thank you, Tanya. Dan, you've got the final word,
very
and then it's over
quickly.
to me.
I will just say, I think try and, it's a very busy discussion, obviously, in terms of all the concepts are thrown out. There's obviously a big attempt as well. We try to identify to sort of distract from some of the things we think need to be thought about. So I suppose I'll just reiterate the two kind of concepts I think are useful to keep in mind, that kind of, to focus on, that are fundamental, but really get distracted from, which is, this idea of datafication. It's a complicated idea in some ways, but it's a really, I think AI in some ways now is part of that. That's the bigger trend we need to be thinking about. And why is that happening? How is that happening? What can we do about it? And then the other is, as came up a minute ago, this, that fundamentally the narratives that are being pushed are technocratic. That's what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to convince us that it's a technical question. It's not one that needs to be contested or part of politics. And so I think keeping in mind those two concepts as things that are really need to be thought about. But otherwise, fantastic discussions. Really loved hearing the other presentations, and then probably the best set of questions I've ever seen in an event, I think, in the Q&A. So it'll be great to look at those as well following the event, anything we haven't covered.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. You stole some of my final words there, Dan. I was going to just thank everyone who joined us on the call today at one stage was over 300 people. So that is really kind of mind-blowing for me and for us. Panelists, you made my job as chair incredibly easy with your wonderful presentations, and also audience engagement has been fantastic with the questions. So a big thank you to the four of you, for everyone who joined us today. As I mentioned, we'll send a follow-up with links to each of the speakers' essays, a recording of this event and the slides, and we'll also take some time to try and provide thoughts to some of the unanswered questions, or many of the unanswered questions that have come along today as well. And then finally from me, I know we're a minute over, it's just, this is a new topic area for us at JRF, and we're really keen to gather feedback on what people are finding useful from us and what they are not, or where we could improve. So if people do have 2 minutes, I think my colleague has just posted a link to a questionnaire. There are only 3 questions, so it should take a couple of minutes for you to answer, and that would be really appreciated, so we can learn and improve as we go along. But yeah, whilst people are filling that out, just a big thank you from me. Thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Wonderful.